One of the most interesting aspects of this condition that's here that doesn't really come into play until one starts to get a little more traction in yoga is the way in which patterning is actually unpatterned. All of obviously experience is full of experiential characteristics which tend to show up in terms of, tend to present in terms of all sorts of apparent patterning. You know, in the visual field there's the patterning of objects, there's the patterning of color, there's the patterning of shapes, so on. In the field of sound there's patterning of different frequency groupings and different, you know, so on and so forth. So, in other words, all this information that seems to appear within experience seems to present with an incredible degree of patterning, which of course is what gives rise to the consensus reality interpretation that because all this is so heavily patterned, these patterns are based on, you know, objectively existing objects, you know, which actually just passes the buck because what's their patterning based on? But at any rate, so all of this pattern, all this intense patterning, of course, you know, we're all very familiar with it, and it gives, you know, most of our typical human functioning consists of relating to these patterns in various ways and orienting to them, and, you know, trying to juggle them, the pattern of your body and the pattern of your communications and the pattern of other bodies and the pattern of objects, and, you know, the patterning of the apparent interaction of all of these patterns and all of this. You know, this is what constitutes normal human life. But the interesting in yoga, when you get to a certain point of depth, you begin to notice that the patterning is actually infinite. The patterns themselves are not resolvable. This is actually a key point because it's on this principle that liberation is based. Liberation arises. but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. So all of this apparent patterning is actually unpatterned. This is how liberation from karma appears, because karma is based on all of these patterns that one is seemingly embedded in. And when one discovers the patterns are actually unpatterned, then naturally karma is not what one thought it was. It's more innuendo or implication than an actuality that one is actually stuck in or has to grapple with. So the principle by which patterns are actually unpatterned is the principle of unresolvability. In other words, if at first take, any pattern seems to be very specifically what it seems to be. You know, you see a person sitting there, or you hear a sound, or, you know, whatever sort of energy presence or experiential characteristics pattern seems to be present, it presents as a kind of a pattern. And if one doesn't look closely, that pattern will tend to perhaps stand up to scrutiny. But if one looks closer, one discovers that any and every pattern is actually unresolvable. That means you cannot pin down exactly what the pattern is. And the pattern doesn't resolve to being precisely a certain way. There's an open-endedness. There's a fuzziness. There's a TMI infinity of information that is intrinsically present in any and every pattern, that takes the flavor of a bottomlessness, so that every pattern has a bottomless richness. So if one looks into a pattern, one keeps finding more and more and more and more, and this more doesn't tend to align with previous discoveries about the pattern. It tends to diverge. So you'll in other words, the more you learn about something, the more different it becomes from itself, from your first take on it. And this continues indefinitely. This continues endlessly. So as one looks experientially into a pattern or any degree of patterning, the pattern turns out to be a contact point with something which is absolutely indefinable, absolutely open-ended. And so in that sense it cannot be felt to be a particular way, a this or a that, even though superficially and without a closer scrutiny it seems very obvious that that's the case. But experience is made of specifics. Experience is not made of generalities. And patterns seem to be most coherent when one approaches them in the most general terms. When you get more and more specific with your actual experience of phenomena, you notice that the more specific you get with it, the more open-ended it becomes, and the less resolvable it becomes, and the less coherent it becomes. So this is a very, very important principle in the yoga, particularly in you might say the higher reaches of it, or the more advanced stages of it. The initial stage of the yoga consists mainly of discovering that one's prior assumptions and interpretive frameworks about what things are and what one is are inaccurate. And that turns the world upside down, and one discovers that the presence of the experiential field is the sole actuality, as opposed to a more consensus reality orientation where it's held to be the presence of an objective world is the sole actuality, and that's what everything is calibrated towards or oriented towards. But when one looks a little scrutiny, one discovers that the objective world is guesswork. It's a hypothesis based upon the patterning, which appears solely within the experiential field, and the experiential field presenting with all of this information is the sole actuality that can be found to be self-verifyingly existing. In other words, it doesn't depend upon you believing in it or holding it to be that way. It doesn't go away when you stop. There's no experiential field. It's like, that doesn't do anything. It's not a powerful statement. It's not a powerful position, because here it is. It's undeniable. And the nature of this experiential field is this that is here. It is actual, and it continually and continually and infinitely presents as experiential characteristics. And this continual presentation I sum up under the notion radiance, and the actuality of this experiential field, the self-verifying obvious fact of its reality, of its actuality, I sum up under the notion of presence. So this is where radiant presence comes from. Yoga entirely concerns attending to experience itself, not to the contents of experience, which of course is more the normal human mode. We're very concerned with our health and our situation in life and our pleasure and our success and so on and so forth, all of which are actually appearing within experience rather than being experience itself, which we tend to take for granted as just this present, more or less transparent field, like a clear window through which we're seeing all the details of our lives. And of course we ignore the window. Who cares about the window? We're interested in what we're seeing through it, all the soap opera and the drama of our lives and our successes and failure and our pleasures and pains and so on and so forth. But the efficacy of yoga comes from attending to experience itself. Now this is very, very subtle, because of course even the idea that experience is something that's appearing in experience is not itself experience. So it's easy to get caught up in little subtle nuances of distraction where one supposes one is attending to experience, whereas actually one is attending more to one's idea of it or to various sub-aspects of it. And, even the idea of attending to it or not attending to it is something that appears in experience, is not experience itself. Experience itself is always being attended to. It does not have degrees of attention. It does not have where there's more or less attention to experience. The presence of the experiential field is always the same. And that sameness is attention. And that level of attention is the important level of attention, not the level of attention that seems to come and go that we can, be paying attention to or be distracted. All of that is occurring within the contents of experience, is not an aspect of experience itself. So it can be quite subtle. Probably the lion's share of one's time in yoga consists of learning to even find what it is that it's about, and becoming more subtle and sophisticated at avoiding being distracted by more heavy-handed fantasies or interpretations about what it actually is. Experience itself is the sole actuality, and it's subtle and complex because, of course, the contents of experience are, in fact, nothing other than experience itself. But the contents of experience seem to have an implication which imply various things, like imply bodies or imply objective world or imply interrelationships and all of these things. Whereas experience itself does not have this kind of implication. Experience only implies itself. And when one comes to see that the contents of experience are actually experience itself, even from that perspective, even the contents of experience don't actually imply all the things that people perhaps usually think they do imply. The contents of experience just imply experience itself. Very much like when one's dreaming. If you're lost in a dream and caught up in a dream, then you're dealing with all of these dream circumstances, and you're trying to relate to whatever the circumstances are, and you're trying to get by or whatever seems to be going on. But if you get the inkling that you are at then all of a sudden the only thing that all of the dream information is implying is the fact of dreaming. At that point it no longer implies all of the apparent scenarios and drama that it would imply if it actually existed autonomously as an actual circumstance or an actual environment composed of elements. Because a dream is not composed of elements. A dream is only composed of dreaming. And likewise, experience is not composed of elements. Experience is only composed of experiencing itself, what I call radiant presence. So all of these apparent, bodies and circumstances, environment in the world and communication and all of these don't actually exist as such. It doesn't all exist, but it all exists as radiant presence. It does not exist as bodies in a world and communication and societies and social situations and all of that. And coming to see the way that this is so, coming to understand the way that this is so, is the essence of the yoga and the essence of genuine spiritual engagement, shall we say. One of the aspects of the yoga which is most difficult, perhaps, to see fully the extent to which it is the way that it is the fact that interpretations define everything whatsoever that seems to exist as anything into being. Everything, any condition, any object whatsoever that seems to be in a certain way is manufactured, essentially imagined by the incredibly powerful interpretive faculty that the inherent intelligence has. So, the world, other human beings, yourself, your body, your history, the past, the future, cause and effect, material objects, I mean, virtually anything whatsoever that could be designated or even vaguely imagined is created within the imagination. It doesn't mean that the actuality is not present. In other words, what I may think of as being my body exists, but it is not either mine or a body. In other words, you could say raw experience exists, but what raw experience actually consists of, in the broadest and most fundamental sense possible, is entirely uninterpretable, entirely indeterminate. It can't be determined. It can't be pinned down what it is. And so the sense of anything actually being a certain way is entirely manufactured by interpretation, by imagination. We're very familiar with this principle in dreams. In a dream, you can seem to be in whatever circumstances dealing with whatever beings and whatever complexities and whatever intricate causes and effects and plot lines and so on and so forth, and yet there's absolutely nothing there. There are no other beings. There is no environment. There are no circumstances. There is no past and future. There is no cause and effect. There is no intricacies whatsoever. There is the dreaming, which looks the way that it looks, as there is this right now, which looks the way that it looks. But that's all that you can say, really, that this is. But this is completely open-ended. As soon as you try to be more specific and pinning, well, what this? A world experience, my life, my history, this talk, you as other beings, this computer, the internet, all of these notions are imagined. They're completely imaginary, nothing but imaginary. Now, again, the actuality is not negated, but the actuality is not what it is imagined to be. It is essential to become familiar with this in the course of the yoga. It's also inevitable to become familiar with it. And it's relatively easy, perhaps, to begin to see this more superficially, but on more intricate levels, it may be harder to see. On the more profound levels, on the more subtle levels, which goes absolutely down to the absolutely most profound, most radical, that essentially there is nothing. Because that this is anything is indeterminate. It seems to be something, but even that, if I look really, a dream seems to be something, but what is it, If you can't, you wake up from a dream and what was it? What was there, That's an unanswerable question. But essentially nothing was there. Somehow experience, but even experience is defined into existence. Experience as experience is imaginary. What is this? We may call it experience, and that seems to be a very broad notion, which kind of is pretty broadly inclusive and includes all of it. But even that, what's there in all to include? What is being included in what? the profundity and the absolute depth of the indefinability of actuality is really what one comes to discover during the course of this yoga, at which point one is freed from being entrapped by all of the conditions which one has imagined exist, because of course that's the only thing that can possibly entrap one, and even if there's any you to be entrapped is itself also imagined into existence. So exploring this and coming to see the way it's directly within the actuality of experience is the course of the yoga, and is essential to penetrate profoundly into what this actually is. To see how profound this is, even that the consciousness exists. Consciousness is also imagined into existence. There's the sense or the feeling or the notion that, well, there is some consciousness, there is some principle that is some perceiving principle that's somehow perceiving, but it can't be found. There isn't nothing like that can be found. Again, it isn't negated. It's not canceled out or erased, but there is nothing to cancel out or erase, because if you look, you can't find it. There is no such thing. That there's a point of view. It's easy to have the subliminal feeling that, experience, perception sort of comes from a locale. Experience sort of comes from a place. But if you look closely, it's just as easy to think that experience permeates the entire space of actuality. And the degrees of focus and seeming localization that seem to present themselves are merely experiential qualities that themselves are appearing within experience, rather than fundamental aspects of experience itself. So it may look like it's easy for me to interpret my experience. Oh, I'm seeing out my eyes, but that I'm seeing out my eyes is itself an appearance, and that appearance doesn't need eyes to appear, and it doesn't actually need seeing out of them in order to seem to be that way. An example is, in the movies, and there's an effect sometimes where someone's looking through a mask, and you see the back of the mask over here, and it sort of comes closer, and there's two eye holes, and it comes up like this, and all of a sudden you're looking through these two eye holes at some scene. But the mask and the perspective that it's appears within the movie, and the movie consists of the whole screen. There is no actual localization to the eye holes. There is no actual localization to the perception. But there's a suggestion of it, there's an innuendo of it, due to the apparent configuration of the qualities that seem to be appearing. And of course there's a lot of apparent configuration of qualities that seem to be appearing, but if one looks closely, those apparent configurations are themselves just appearing. They aren't necessarily essential to the fundamental, radical event or condition that is this occurrence. So, the most you can say about the way anything seems to be is it seems to be that way. And even that it seems to be that way is itself defined into existence, is itself imagined into existence. The profundity and the fundamental, the radical fundamental comprehensiveness of this fact really can't be overemphasized. Everything is defined into existence. Everything is imagined into existence, whatsoever. There is actuality, apparently, maybe, but even that actuality is actuality, even that it is. I mean, all of these, the most fundamental notions are all fantasies. And so what does that leave you with? The essential method of yoga of radiant presence, or ultimately of any successful yoga, is to notice the way in which actual experience differs from what it's held to be, what our ideas of it are, what our conceptions of it are. Our conceptions of it are describable. They tend to be stable. This thing on my lap I call a computer. I called it a computer yesterday. I'll probably call it a computer tomorrow. I called it a computer several years ago. So the computerness of it is static and stable, which indicates that right away it's imaginary, because nothing in actuality, nothing in experience is static and stable. My experience of this actuality that I'm calling a computer is never the same twice. It's always different. It has different colors, different brightnesses, different shades, different textures, different shapes, and so on, in terms of the actual experiencing of what it is. And of course there's nothing there but the experiencing. I can hold, no, there's a real computer there which is static and unchanging, and my experience is changing. But there's no evidence of that, because the only evidence that there's a computer at all is the fact of my experience. So it puts the cart before the horse to have experience, and then to form static ideas about it, and then to suppose that the static ideas are what's really there, and the experience is somehow deviating from that as an error, as an artifact of some error, some sloppiness of observation, and that the actual fixed things are out there and sitting static. Because the ideas that there are fixed things was derived from the experience, not the other way around. The fact of experiencing is the primal fact. It's the fundamental radical fact, the presence of the experiential field, we might call it. And this actuality is very clearly and explicitly the way that it is. And we all, of course, are very familiar with it. You've never actually experienced anything else ever. So you're familiar with its fluidity, you're familiar with its absolute changefulness, you're familiar with the fact that it never repeats itself precisely. You're familiar with the fact that no stability can be found. If you go to any experience whatsoever, that instantaneously your presence with that experience will tend to drift and mutate and fluctuate and morph and experience and reveal a liveliness or a dynamism that is unstoppable and that is consistently in evidence and always in evidence. In fact, no fixed stability can be found. So one of the very simplest indicators, or one of the very simplest telltales of the difference between an interpretation, an imaginary interpretation, and the actuality of radiant presence, of experience itself, is this staticness, because concepts can seem to be static. They don't seem to change. They are, as I said with this example of my computer. The computer is a computer, and it doesn't stop being a computer. There's this idea of a computer which is just this fixed archetype sitting there, as in its gem-like purity that in no way will ever change until I reimagine it, of course. But this, again, as I said, flies in the face of the actual evidence of experience itself, which is quite the contrary. So, in the beginning, and actually ultimately all along every step of the way, every stage of the way in this yoga, this cutting edge between the actuality of experience versus this overlay of interpretive frameworks, this overlay of imaginary interpretations, and defining conditions and defining things to be this and that and to be a certain way. The cutting edge, or the balance between these two different modes, always coexists in our experiential field. And learning to differentiate these two is the key to success in yoga radiant presence. Largely, it's a remedial activity to correct the heavy-handed brainwashing we've all received as humans in overemphasizing the interpretive, conceptual, imaginary side of things. Most people are completely brainwashed into thinking that their imaginary interpretations of things are what is actually here, are what is actually going on, which of course is not the case. And so discovering that's not the case, clearly seeing that's not the case, and then seeing what is actually here and what its nature is and what its qualities are, is the entirety of the technique of the yoga. Now, as I've touched upon many other times, once one learns to become more sensitively aware of the presence of actuality, of actual radiant presence, its qualities and its nature begin to reveal themselves, begin to convey themselves irrationally and hyper-intelligently through that very nature itself. Because the nature that's being displayed in all of the activity of experience and the nature of what is perceiving that experience is one and the same. So the hyper-intelligent, irrational, infinite nature of the radiance as an objective field is of exactly the same nature as the infinite, transcendental, hyper-intelligent consciousness that is perceiving it. And of course, calling it a consciousness and all that is another aspect of interpretation, because no consciousness can be found. There is clearly this curious, to say the least, fact of experiencing, but no parts or components can be found. Consciousness cannot be found and distinguished from objective fields, which cannot be found in themselves. Nothing whatsoever can be found other than this astounding, continuous, inclusive gestalt of radiant presence. And of course, coming to see the way in which that's so, and coming to understand within its own modes what it is and how it is that, and especially the absolute inclusiveness of its being, that there is nothing else, that it is all, is the goal of the yoga, and in the later stages is the path of the yoga as well. What seems to be happening, whatever you seem to do or don't do, what seems to appear within your experience, is of no importance at all for the purposes of yoga. This is very contrary to our normal human modes, of course, where we're very concerned with what seems to be appearing in our experience, what happens to us, what we do, what we don't do, and especially organizing around what we think we need to do in order to achieve certain goals or to avoid certain pitfalls or what have you. So there's, the normal human mode consists of all sorts of strategizing around our actions and around orienting towards what seems to be happening and assessing it. Is it good or is it bad? Do I like it? Are things okay? Are things not okay? Or, are things great? Are things the usual kind of mix of not so great but tolerable. And mainstream spirituality supports this consensus reality point of view pretty much by giving all these wonderful recipes of, oh, when you need to meditate, or you need to, do 100,000 prostrations, or you need to, get a guru and take get some fancy name, or whatever. But there's all of these recipes and all of these recommendations of what you should be doing, what you should be avoiding, what you should be trying to go towards. And none of it matters in the slightest, it turns out. So, what things look like, what it seems to be going on, is of absolutely no importance from the point of view of yoga, from the point of view of true spirituality. What does matter is what this is. You could say what appears, what seems to be happening, is of no importance, but that it appears, the way in which it appears, is what is important. It's the medium of being itself, the medium of experience itself, which is interesting, not what experience seems to look like, and not what you do and strategize within experience in order to navigate it and to try to get to the places you think you want to be. And this is a rather foreign mode. People who are not artists or stoners or mystics are not generally very interested in looking at experience itself. Because we so normally go to some idea of what seems to be occurring or what we seem to be doing within that. But it is in what experience itself is that the value is to be found, that liberation and realization are to be discovered. Experience is obviously not hidden. The main reason it seems to be so difficult to get at this hidden gem of this amazing condition that is so omnipresent is through our constant distraction with all of the events and our identification with our own status and our own trying to win the game or achieve some goal or what have you. It's all of that obsession and distraction that prevents one from simply noticing this astounding condition, which is actually plain to see and actually completely obvious and not concealed in any way whatsoever. So that's really the crux of the matter there. So don't worry about what's going on in your life, and it's very paradoxical and subtle, because even if you're worrying and concerned about what's going on in your life, don't worry about worrying about it. Don't worry about being concerned about it. So be as concerned as you want about what's going on in your life. You can be an obsessive jerk and just chase around trying to, become president of the United States or something, or whatever it is you want to do. And even if you want to do that, it doesn't matter that you want to do that if you see that it doesn't matter. So it's not a matter of repressing that or suppressing experience or suppressing the events that seem to be occurring. It's just a matter of not caring about them one way or the other. And even if you are caring about them, don't care that you care about them, and that does the same thing. So even if you're really caught up in your life, just write that off, and then where are you? Well, here I am. What is this? It's here. And that's where the hidden treasure is to be found. That's where the alchemical pearl of great price is located. A fine point in spirituality, but an essential point, is, particularly in practical terms, for the investigations of a yogi, of the aspirant to try to explore what one's situation is here and discover it, is that it is, I think, very, very commonplace for people to suppose that there is some kind of a absolute condition which is somehow subtly different from this condition, from the condition of one's appearances or one's superficialities. So it's very easy to. Can you not? I'm sorry. Anyway, it's very easy to think subtly. I have to get away from my sensory experience, from the presence of normalcy, and somehow get to this transcendental place, or this special experience, or this something that is somehow, superior. And I think this is quite possible, even with people who have a very refined understanding. It's still very easy to have a subtle, to still hold a subtle notion that there is some kind of a superior condition. And this is not the case. This that is right here, and it's absolute, specifically exactly the way it is the absolute condition. There's absolutely no, question of, there is some better absolute condition, there's some superior or pure absolute condition that, that I just need to get to, and then I'll be liberated, and then I'll be, a saint, and then I'll be, enlightened, and all of these kinds of things. Enlightenment is simply seeing what this is. This right here, there's no specialness involved, there's no refinement involved, there's no subtlety involved. I mean, it itself happens to be infinitely subtle, so the subtlety comes with, but the subtlety is found in absolute normalcy, in whatever happens to be present exactly the way that it is. But it can be very difficult to avoid or to get out of the clutches of this very subtle. There's some condition, there's some superior condition, there's some enlightenment, there's some. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to see that, and then that's going to solve everything. Then I'm going to be out of this, and I'm going to be free of this. Whereas actually, it's a matter of seeing that you're not in anything, you're not free of anything. Already, you always have been, always will be. And even that seeing is not in itself special. It's not different from any other seeing. It's simply acknowledging what is clearly the case, as opposed to, orienting to all sorts of fantasies about what it is. As usual, the villain of the piece, if there was one, is fantasy and imagination. Not recognizing that fantasy is fantasy. Fantasy is perfectly fine, but if one starts to confuse one's fantasies, one's projections, one's imaginings as actuality, that's where trouble comes in. That's where spiritual bondage comes in. That's where stuckness comes in. That's where, feeling like one is, limited and stuck and not realized, and all of these kinds of things. Because of the amazing power of consciousness, which is essentially hypnotic, the consciousness has a miraculous ability to orient towards a notion and then try to actualize it hypnotically as if it was true. And we all experience this very clearly when we go to a movie, for example. You go into the movie and you sit there and it's a movie. It might even be a movie you don't particularly like, but still in all, some degree of your consciousness takes the information that's being fed from the movie and tries to simulate it and feel what it would be like if you were in that situation. So to whatever degree, there's some degree of actualization of what that would feel like. a kind of a hypnosis of projecting oneself imaginarily into that situation. And this is exactly, the spiritual problem consists of exactly this. One has been trained or fallen into fantasies of being a limited individual existing in space and time, existing dependent on various conditions, and so on and so forth. And simply noticing that is not the case, that all of that fantasy is actually a hypothesis that the mind generates. It's a reasonable hypothesis. The mind generates it on the basis of the evidence that is being presented from the senses, as well as on the basis of all sorts of training and suggestion and innuendo that comes from outside and from other people and so on and so forth, to create this fantasy that one unconsciously orients to. And it feels like it's like that. It's possible to feel like one is stuck, feel like one is limited, feel like one is, all of these various problematic conditions which the typical spiritual aspirant is, fighting, kicking, and screaming to get out of. But the actuality is there's nothing there. And the solution to the problem is simply to see that, simply see what is the evidence, what is actually here. And if you look what's actually here, you cannot find any stuckness, you cannot find any smallness, you cannot find any individuality. All of these conditions which seem to be the problem don't actually exist. They're fantasies. And of course, this discovery doesn't free one, because one was never not free, but one notices, oh yeah, it's kind of like getting really sucked into a horror movie and getting really jerked around, and you're like, oh no, this is horrible. And then at the end of the movie, it's like, oh, it was just a movie, thank God. There's no slasher coming after me, It's basically exactly the same mechanism. It's just really the same condition. And so the point is, see that it's a damn movie. See that there is no slasher. I mean, allegorically speaking. And where one looks is not in some specialness that is outside of one's stuckness or outside of one's smallness. One looks at everything and anything that is experientially present. One looks at one's experience. There's no special experience. There's no enlightened experience. There's no realized experience. Experience is what it is. And what it is inconceivably bizarre and amazing, and happens to be what all the fuss is about. All the hyperbole of describing spiritual achievement is really just about what this condition happens to be. But it's not something you have to get to. It's something that is already always the case. And so it's a relatively simple matter, at least theoretically, to notice that. I'm here to present the Yoga of Radiant Presence, which is both the easiest thing and the most difficult thing it would be possible to do. Paradoxically, its most subtle and most profound aspect is also its simplest and its easiest. The absolute depth, the absolute most subtle, most profound aspect of reality itself, of the intrinsic yoga of reality itself, relating with itself, being with itself, its own intrinsic process, is simply this. What could be simpler? This sits right here. That's the absolute depth of it. That's the absolute most profound aspect of it, as well as the simplest. The mark of realization is you can stop there. The mark of being a very advanced yogi is you can almost stop there. A mark of being a perhaps slightly lesser yogi is, yeah, but what about? This obviously is already what it is. It is complete. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken away from it. It is absolutely inclusive. There's nothing omitted, nothing missing. It is absolutely autonomous. It depends on absolutely nothing. And if there were anything else, it would depend on it. So it is its own mother, its own father, it's its own root, and its own tree, so on and so forth. And yet, it's right here. This actuality that is right here. It's completely blatantly obvious. There's nothing hidden about it. I would say nothing subtle about it, but that might not be really useful information, really clear information, because of course it is actually infinitely subtle. Which is where the challenge is in yoga come up. So this that's here is completely obvious. This complete obviousness is also infinitely subtle. So you can be with this obviousness and move into it. In fact, it spontaneously tends to move into itself with more and more and more merging and opening into subtlety, into seeming elaboration, into seeming nuance, into infinite, literally infinite depths of profundity and meaningfulness and flavorfulness and implication and so on and so forth. But none of that departs from this. It's like looking at the ocean. You're sitting here at the beach, you look at the ocean, you're looking at the surface of the ocean. But you can go into the ocean, supposing you're equipped to do so, or you're disembodied in a thought experiment or what have you. You can go into the ocean, and you can just keep going and going, and there's no limit to what you can discover. But it's just the ocean. It's the same thing you were looking at when you were just looking at the surface of it. And that's this. That's what this is like. It is not, it has no dichotomy within it. It is not this or that. It is not either or. It is not superficial or deep. The depth is the same thing as the superficial is the same thing as the depth. So wherever you are with it, you haven't gone anywhere. It's not like an ocean which presents as if it's a three-dimensional system. There's a surface and there's the depths, and the surface is here and the depths are there, and the depths aren't at the surface and the surface aren't at the depths, even though it's a continuum, and so on and so forth. This is not like that. This is stranger than that. You go into the depths and you haven't left the surface. You go to the surface and you haven't left the depths. It's a very, very strange actuality that is not modelable, it's not conceivable because of this intrinsically, from a logical point of view, paradoxical nature that it consists of. And it is this that presents all the conundrums. Because as human beings, we've been conditioned very heavily into a conceptual mode and a semantic mode of distinguishing between this and that, as we're all totally familiar with. And which we consider useful and certainly may be useful within its gamut. But what this is doesn't work like that. What this is not structured like that. And so, an aspirant, a yoga aspirant, approaches this, and the natural impulse is to approach it the way you would approach anything. Well, let me figure this out. Give me the data. Give me the info. What do you do? What is it? What isn't it? And all of these kinds of questions. And it's just not like that. Those kinds of questions based on differentiation, based upon distinguishing between this and that, just don't apply to this. So the biggest hurdle for the yogi is coming to see the way that this is so. The way that everything is both and. There's no either or. Everything is both and. So however it is, it can also be another way and a myriad of ways and no way and everything without there being any contradiction at all or any disjunction at all. It's just a seamless inclusive continuity which never departs from itself, regardless of the apparent elaborations that seem to be presenting experientially. So it demands learning, or actually recognizing, a different mode of intelligent engagement. It doesn't need to be learned because it's a mode of intelligent engagement that has always been occurring ongoingly and that we're all intimately familiar with, but most of us are not in the habit of acknowledging it because it occurs what, in terms of our parapsychology, could be called unconsciously. And we're used to identifying with and thinking and functioning in terms of a conscious mentality approach to things, with analytical thought and conceptualization and modeling and abstraction and so on and so forth. But even as you've been doing that, you've also actually been engaging with the inherent intelligence, which is the mode of the intelligence that this consists of intrinsically, and that that manifests you, and that is, of course, a manifestation of what you are, that is always fully in operation. But again, typically it's not recognized or not acknowledged because typically we're so distracted by these conscious, analytical, abstracted modes of approaching things. So this is a wonderful foot in the door. This is a wonderful shortcut. Since you're already doing this other mode of engagement, since you're already completely engaged with with your actuality as the inherent intelligence, it's simply a matter of recognizing that's the case. You don't actually have to do anything. You don't actually have to learn anything. There's nothing new that you need to acquire. There's nothing you even need to forget or ignore. Simply come to recognize this more primal, fundamental, inclusive, infinite mode, which has always been in operation. So you could say it's a matter of instead of fixating upon conscious analytical modes, one relaxes into what feels like an expansive, inclusive, very vibrant, very vital mode, but it's a mode that is not abstracted. It's a mode that is not conceptual. It's a mode that does not consist of intellectual and mental models of things, but the presence of the things itself. As all of you know, I refer to this process as noticing. So one comes to notice this other mode that has always been in operation, and we're actually very, very familiar with it. We just typically don't acknowledge it as valuable. We don't think of it as anything. We just think of it as, well, as experience. Sure, yeah, of course I'm experiencing, but what's happening? Whereas the experiencing itself is this other mode. The experiencing itself is the intrinsic hyperfunctionality of reality itself. The subtlety and the insidiousness with which the inherent identifying principle, let's call it, or functionality of consciousness can identify with conscious modes of functioning and conscious identifications is also very challenging. Because even as one makes profound headway in moving into subtlety and coming to notice and recognize and settle into the more profound intrinsic, inclusive beingness that experience consists of, there can be still a more subtle identification with rational analytical modes that can be operant in the background, or maybe not so in the background, but that can enable one to, that can serve as a kind of an anchor, or a kind of a, something that one can seem to keep stubbing one's spiritual toes on in the course of one's, yogic wandering. And so this is another aspect of the challenge of yoga. So even when one has, made a major progress in recognizing the intrinsic nature, there can still be a kind of a umbilical, keeping one tethered to one's habitual identification with conscious modes and so on and so forth. And so the process of yoga consists of looking at all of these issues in every mode, looking at them analytically, looking at them directly in terms of what they actually are, until ultimately true seeing can occur, which consists of simply seeing this as it is, which of course includes conscious modes, it includes abstraction, it includes intellectualization, it includes identification, it includes all these things, at which point all of these apparent submodes cease to be an issue, cease to be a problem, because they're seen to actually be this itself. Because one recognizes that nothing can depart from this. And so if one's caught up in one's trivialities and one's absurdities and one's egoic identifications, who cares? Because it is this itself, which is the high watermark of yoga, and it's what realization looks like. It's very easy for yogis along the way to still, again, largely due, or I'd say exclusively due, perhaps, to this, perhaps subtle clinging to an analytical orientation. It can be very easy to hold the subtle notion that one needs to get away from get away from that and get to this. One needs to stop that and get to this. One needs to get out of the intellectualization. One needs to get out of the conceptual and egoic identification, or de-emphasize it, or turn it down, or shut it off, or whatever, and get to this over here, which is the real thing. And that's just not true. It's not actually like that. But it can be tricky to come to see that it's not like that, evidently. This is absolutely specific. It's in no way general. It's exactly what it happens to be now, here now, the actuality, the specifics of exactly what your experience is. As humans, we're used to orienting to generalities to various degrees. All our mental categories of, this is a this and that's a that, and this is experience and this is, all basically deal in generalities. generalities are posited, and then the generalities are held to apply to this. But this is never a generality. It's always precisely exactly what it is, the way it is, when it is that way, which is now. And it's in the specifics, it's in the absolute precision of exactly the way it is that it reveals itself, that its transcendental nature becomes clear. And this is also contrary, I think, to a lot of sloppy spiritual thinking, where, this is sort of some kind of a sense to various degrees of you're supposed to space out, you're supposed to let things go, you're supposed to somehow distance yourself from things, or it's a kind of a overall escapist sensibility. And this is exactly the opposite. This is precise, completely intimate engagement with exactly what this is. Right now, always, right here, right now. It might be useful for the purpose of yoga to look at your actuality as if it consisted of 3 layers. The first layer is the layer of apparitional forms. So you can look at that in terms of the apparent appearance of your body and its the very stimulus that you associate with being your body. You can look at it in terms of your environment, the objects that make up your environment, other beings, and so on and so forth. Just the pure mechanical apparition of all of these shapes and forms and textures. The second layer is how you seem to be situated within all of these phenomena. And this layer is essentially what it feels like to you. So if you feel joyful, if you feel depressed, if you feel frustrated, if you feel successful, if you feel blissful and transcendental, if you feel small and oppressed and dependent, all these kinds of flavors that the experience can appear in terms of is essentially how you're sitting within the apparitional forms that form the neutral basis for your condition. And we, as humans, we spend a lot of time with this layer. It's the layer that most spirituality attends to. Trying to feel bliss, trying to feel transcendental, trying to feel open, trying to feel clear, perhaps trying to feel no suffering, these kinds of things. The mode of navigation within this layer is essentially hypnotic. So one orients within this layer through a process of suggestion, basically an imagined narrative or imagined narratives that spin an interpretation of what the phenomena of the first layer that are actually neutral are implying in terms of what the meaning of it is, what it should feel like, what your reaction to it is. Now the third layer is really the layer that concerns us in terms of yoga. The third layer is the layer of radiant presence. This layer is generally unknown and unrecognized by the majority of humans. And coming to coming to see and coming to understand this layer is the essence of the goal of yoga. So the first layer is just forms appearing. It's completely neutral. It has all sorts of colors, shapes, sounds, textures of touch. All these various sort of the raw information of the experience itself. And this includes not just sensory experience, it also includes the presence of mental phenomena, the presence of thought, the presence of emotion, all these kinds of things. Anything that appears is basically a form appearing. And all of these forms are essentially neutral. They don't have a value plus or minus. It's like you see a rock on a hillside. It's not good or bad. It's just just there. And likewise, you see, I look in the mirror and I see my face. It's not good or bad. It's just there. Now, the second layer is where the good and bad gets applied. Is where the interpretive frameworks get applied, and it becomes a story. So I look at my face and, oh my God, I'm getting old. I'm probably, my health isn't as good as it once was. I'm probably going to die before long. Oh no, all these kinds of narratives, and then the emotional reactive implication of these narratives all occur within this layer. So this layer is not neutral, seemingly. It uses the basis of the neutral apparition of forms as a kind of a medium to free associate all of the interpretive frameworks that then imply a reaction, and then that's what you feel like you are. That's what you feel like your experience is. Now, as I said, most popular spirituality focuses on this layer pretty much exclusively. People want to feel bliss. They want to feel clear. They want to feel, disentangled or what have you, as opposed to entrapped and caught up and lost. I was lost in my emotions today. I wasn't able to maintain a clear perspective. I need to go sit on my cushion and meditate some more. This kind of thing. And all of that is very doable. So all of this, again, one can acquire a skill or facility in these kind of hypnotic navigation techniques and navigate within this layer of narrative, this layer of interpretive framework, quite skillfully, possibly. So this is essentially a layer of magical functioning. One finds a perspective on things that has a desirable flavor and implication. Now, from the point of view of yoga, all of that's completely irrelevant, unbeknownst to probably most people. The important thing is the third layer, the layer of radiant presence, the layer of this actuality which alone exists and which the other two layers actually consist of. Now, coming to see that is the case, coming to see very clearly, feel very clearly, to know very clearly across the board through all vectors and media of knowing, of seeing, of perceiving, that what this actually is, one comes to see that there is nothing but radiant presence, and these other two apparent layers are just artifacts of the way of the, you could say, the texture of radiant presence itself. So they're a complete non-entity. So as you can see, this is quite contrary to the normal human way of orienting, which is very, very concerned with the first two layers. I want to be rich, I want to be healthy, I want to be popular, I want to be happy, I want to be, all these various things. And I want to have lots of beautiful things around me. All this kind of stuff. So these are all kind of first and second layer concerns, first and second layer investments. And they're all totally irrelevant. Again, you can go to a dream analogy and see all this very clearly. In the dream, there's the appearance of apparent events, circumstances, which is layer one. Then there's the reaction to all of that and the feeling of, oh, this is a nightmare, or this is a blissful dream, or whatever, which is layer two. And then there's the fact of dreaming itself, which is layer three, the layer of radiant presence. It's just the fact of that all this exists, and that by its very nature it happens to look like all these circumstances. It happens to be interpretable as being all the various ways it can be interpreted. But it isn't intrinsically any of that. What it intrinsically is, in the case of dreaming, is just that, dreaming. And the dreaming itself is what seems to be all of this complexity, without any actual complexity appearing at all. So likewise, any and all actuality is just like this. So this so-called waking state, is just the same. You have this, there's all these colors and lights and sounds and feelings and what have you. Later one, there's how does it feel? Am I happy now? Am I sad? Am I caught up? Am I clear? Am I, contented? Am I frustrated or annoyed? Whatever, So and that's all floating around however it is. And I may be navigating within that in whatever ways according to my skill set of what I've developed to be able to do that. So that's layer two. But actually, all that's here is radiant presence. Concretely, substantially, literally, not in a metaphorical sense or a weak sense, but in the most powerful sense. There is absolutely nothing here. The substance of that I perceive as matter is actually radiance. What I perceive as light is actually radiance. What I perceive as thought is actually radiance. What I perceive as my reaction to those things and my sense of myself is radiance. The entire thing is that, concretely and actually and substantially. And this can be known, this can be seen very clearly and completely comprehensively, and this, of course, is the goal of yoga. Spiritual practice consists of connecting with your experience, the actuality of your experience. Your experience is the only thing that exists. All of the world appears in your experience. Your body appears in your experience. Other people appear in your experience. If your experience wasn't there, none of these things would appear. Your experience is the only thing that's actual. It's the only thing you actually have. Now, seeing this way is contrary to the normal consensus reality way of seeing things, where one imagines one's experience as being a small byproduct of the body, and the world is what's real, and people are what's real, and society is what's real, and the solar system is what's real, and the universe is what's real. But that's not true. That's not actual. If you look, the actuality is the only thing that's real is your experience, and everything that seems to be actual is appearing in your experience, and the only reason it seems actual is because it's appearing in your experience. If it's not appearing in your experience, it doesn't exist. You have a dream, the dream is actual because it's appearing in your experience. As soon as the dream's over and you wake up, the dream's gone forever. It may as well have never happened. Suppose you dream and you're in some place and there's some people you're interacting with. You wake up, those people are gone, that place is gone. That place only existed because it was appearing in your experience. This world, right now you're sitting, probably looking at a computer, sitting in a room. The room is appearing in your experience. The computer is appearing in your experience. The experience is the actuality. The experience is what's real, and everything that appears in it is just a byproduct of experience itself. This applies to your body, for example. Your body appears in your waking experience. You go to sleep, your body disappears. You start dreaming, maybe you have a new body. Your personality appears in your experience. You're not your personality. Your personality is just something that's appearing in you from time to time. Again, you go to sleep, your personality is gone. You know, who are you when you're in deep sleep? So on and so forth. So the essential point is to come to see very clearly that your experience is the only thing that actually exists, and that you are the experiential field. You are not the body that's appearing in that field. You are not the persona that's appearing in that field. You are the experiential field itself. This is really very easy to see if you just take the time to look at your experience. You know, anything that is actual solely because it's appearing in your experience. And as soon as it's not appearing, it's gone. It doesn't exist. And come to see the truth of this, come to see the power of this, and you'll be seeing the true perspective of what you are, of your situation. Understanding spirituality is very simple when you understand what the principles are. Samsara is fantasy. So that being lost in samsara simply means being lost in fantasy, essentially being a crazy person. So being lost in samsara simply means being lost in fantasy, being lost in imagination, not being able to distinguish between actuality and your fantasy of it, your imagination of it. Reality itself, of course, is the condition of actuality, what is. Actuality only exists. Fantasy exists within actuality, and fantasy is actual, but fantasy is actual fantasy, it's actual imagination. Not being able to distinguish what fantasy imagines to be the case from what is actually the case is the condition of samsara. This is the condition of, this is the spiritual problem, it's the soul spiritual problem. So essentially, spiritual training, if any, consists of learning to distinguish between fantasy and reality, learning to distinguish between the contents of imagination and what is actually present. So there's no other complexities involved. This is exceedingly simple. The subtlety of it becomes involved in the subtlety of actuality, the complexity of actuality in terms of how it presents itself, as well as the ingeniousness of fantasy, the ingeniousness of the intelligence that fantasizes. It generates fantasy at an extremely subtle level, and then we have the fact of a lifelong having been steeped in relating to fantasy, relating to actuality in terms of one's fantasies of it, which is the dominant human mode, which we've all been trained in all our lives by society and parents and essentially the entire human milieu. So this is the challenge. This is the essential contest in spirituality is between fantasy and actuality. So it's very simple. That's all you need to know. So spirituality is extremely simple. In its entirety, it consists of the practical fact that what this is not what you think it is. What you are is not what you think you are. So it's simply a matter of discovering what this actually is and letting go of orienting to your mistaken notions of what you're used to thinking it is. That constitutes success in spirituality, constitutes realization, which is a very simple thing. What makes it not so simple is habit and the perversity of the mind and the energy system that fixates on and holds on to the ways it's been doing things. It's very conservative. It's very habit-oriented. So it's actually very easy to see actuality the way it is. What's hard is not to see reality. What's hard is to let go of unreality. Because typically we have a lifelong, at least lifelong, habit of orienting to our mistaken notion of what this is. The good news is that actuality is not in any way hidden or concealed. It's completely nakedly displayed. And it's completely obvious the ways that it deviates from what people typically mistake it to be. So that's an overview of the whole thing. The process is one of orienting to the actuality of experience, rather than interpretations or concepts and imaginations, fantasies of experience. This can be a little tricky because we're used to orienting to fantasies, to imaginings, and thinking that they are actual. So learning to discriminate between what's imaginary and what's fantasy and what is actual can be an aspect of this too. But rather than deconstructing imagination, the simplest approach is simply attend to actuality, attend to the way it is, and the very way that it is, the very evidence that it will continually present of its nature will inherently undermine and contradict the fantasies and imaginings that we're used to having about what it is and what we are. Some very gross generalized examples of this contrast is, for example, we might typically imagine we live in a stream of history with the past and the present and the future, whereas the actual fact, the actual evidence of experience is simply the fact of the present moment. It's the only thing that actually exists. Likewise, we may imagine we live in a vast space. The whole material universe is outside ourselves, but it's impossible to find anything like that. All one can find is patterns appearing within one's own experience, and no other space other than the space of one's experience can be found. So on and so forth. Anyway, all of this, the details of this are for one to play with, and of course we can talk about that at great length. But it's rather a personal matter. The important thing is one has to find this for oneself. One has to look at the actuality, the immediacy of one's own being, and relax and recognize what it is. And notice the ways that it is not, that it deviates from what we're used to imagining it is. In genuine yoga, it's essential for one to be dealing with the actuality of one's experience. it's worse than useless to try to relate to a bunch of theory or philosophy or abstract notions of what things are and how they should be. It's absolutely essential that the yogi deals with what one is actually dealing with, so to speak, is with what one is actually being with, so to speak, at the moment. Because right now is when yoga is occurring. And the guise it's taking is the guise that it's taking right now. It is not some theoretical abstraction. It's not some notion of what it should be. It is exactly what it is being. And so one has to be brutally honest and engaged with the objective actuality, the actual fact of one's experience just as it is right here, right now. And that is where the artistry of yoga comes in. That is where the skillfulness of yoga comes in. Not in accumulating facts and notions of these grand, absolutes and so on and so forth. Yoga is above all pragmatic. Yoga is above all practical, and the practice is this here. And it's always being practiced, always has been being practiced. There's nothing else. What we call life is yoga. And the skillful yogi will take advantage of this fact and make the most of it. So on that theme of less theory, more specifics, I now turn the talk over to, and this is why I conduct these talks in a context of mostly discussion and less me sitting here pontificating about absolutes, because the important point for you is what's going on with you and how are you being with it. That is where the headway is made, so to speak. That is where yoga is mastered, is you in your experience right here, right now, just as it is. I think tonight I'll talk about I don't know. I don't know is an absolutely fundamental weapon which cuts right to the quick of actuality of what this is, because it is true, and this truth is supremely powerful. It is supremely actual. All of our pretense at knowing, all of our pretense at knowledge that we claim to be able to say, basically any kind of verbal descriptions or narrations, is a lie, is posturing. Because of course at root, if you're brutally honest, you don't really know what anything is in terms of describing it or analyzing it or putting it into concepts or putting it into words, which of course we're very used to doing as human beings. All these, words we throw back and forth at each other that we pretend has content and has value. Of course, this is all bravado. This is a game we play that is actually untrue, is actually based on a falsehood, based on a lie. And we know this fundamentally, whether or not we will admit it, whether or not you can cut to the simple, naked recognition right now that you don't know what anything is. You cannot describe what anything is. You cannot analyze what anything is. So therefore, all of anything you can say, today's Monday, and this is San Rafael, and I'm on planet Earth, and anything you can say is basically a fabrication. It rests upon. So if you peel back the layers, if you say, well, how do you know? So I'm on planet Earth. Well, how do I know that? Well, because Earth is the designation of the planet that I'm on. Well, that's kind of circular. Okay. So here's I'm on planet Earth. What does that refer to? It's something that I know. And I was told that I was on planet Earth. I was told that I was on a planet. I've seen these pictures that I've been told are from, being shot from the moon or from the space station or something, that seem to show this circular, seemingly spherical image floating in dark space, and they say this is Earth, and supposedly I'm on this. But again, this is just supposedly. There's all of this. Everything rests upon something else that has been said or something else that has been taught. And where did that come from? And then you keep going back, where did that come from? Where did that come from? Where did that come from? And you get to a point where someone just made it up. Someone just, pulled it out of their ass, basically. Just completely fabricated this based upon nothing. And this doesn't affect experience whatsoever. If I say I'm on planet Earth, well, this. If I say I don't know where I am or what location is or what amness is or what I am, this is the same in either case. And this is exactly the point. This overlay, this veneer of a posturing of an accumulation of supposed facts, an accumulation of supposed knowledge that we can all regurgitate on demand, is based upon nothing. If you take it back, it's based upon hearsay. And the hearsay comes from other hearsay, and the hearsay comes from other hearsay, and at some point someone just invented it. Someone just made it up. This is space, this is time. Oh, okay, great. What? Where? And then, the proof of this is that you have the most cutting-edge researchers, the smartest minds in their fields are looking at, well, what is space, what is time? And they can't answer these questions. But this is space, this is time. It's very simple. Everyone knows that. What are you, stupid? But the fact of the matter is that anything that can be said is a fabrication. And it's easy to forget this because, we're all so steeped in this human gamesmanship of being able to, throw our personal perspectives back and forth at each other as if it was relevant or meaningful. And this is just that. It's a game. It has no. It doesn't ever tie in to reality. It doesn't ever tie into actuality. At some point, there was just a leap. Someone made up a word, made up a notion, and then everyone else parrots that notion. I mean, all this whole, this current buzzword of fake news. It's all fake news. Everything is fake news. Anything you can say is fake news. Someone just made it up. It's that simple, And it's really quite easy to see if you look for it and if you're honest. So this is why seeing the truth of I don't know in your own experience right here, right now, to see, well, do you really know anything. Anything you think you know, look at what that's based on, and it goes back and back and back, and it gets to a point where it's just floating there. Well, I was told that. I read that. Everyone says that, but it doesn't ever tie into this. This is complete, entire, seamless, inclusive wholeness, and nothing ties into it. Of course, nothing departs from it, but none of this analysis, none of this conceptualization, none of this structuralization ever ties into it. It is always actually elusive in terms of being able to analyze whatsoever, being able to structuralize or reverse engineer whatsoever. And noticing this fact is actually fairly simple and easy, because it's actually both true and obvious once you pay attention to noticing this. Is very powerful, because, of course, this is not the problem. The only spiritual problem, if there was one, is all of this bullshit that we've been so heavy-handedly trained in, and we allow ourselves to, and we have invested in it as a kind of a gamesmanship, typically, and we allow ourselves to be sucked into the asserted relevance of all of this, when in actuality it has nothing to do with anything. It's just hot air. Whereas what does matter, what is actual, what is real, this that is here, has nothing to do with any of that. And so bypassing the relevance of all that, noticing the irrelevance of all that, makes this very clear and reveals the true perspective, which is that this actuality is the Alpha and Omega, is what is relevant, is what is powerful, is what is liberated, is what is wonderful, is life, and is transcendental. And all of this is obvious once one gets out of one's own way and quits claiming other than that by asserted bullshit. Confusion is surprising because it's seen as a problem. Where people typically are used to wanting to have a handle on things, wanting to, have some sense of what things are. Particularly in spirituality, the confused state, the unrealized state, the state of delusion, is often held to be confusion, and the solution of finding out what's really happening, of coming to see what things really are, is seen as an end of confusion often. And this is not actually true. Confusion is the actual condition. The actual condition is one of confusion, in the sense that it's impossible to get a handle on it. It's impossible to know what it is. It's impossible to pin it down. So in a profound sense, spirituality is the opposite of what one might think it is. Spirituality is becoming comfortable with confusion, letting go of the idea that you're supposed to have some idea of what's going on in any sense whatsoever, and learning to be comfortable with the true condition, where nothing makes any sense whatsoever, and there's no way whatsoever to get a handle on what's going on or what's happening or what anything is. Confusion is an implication of unresolvability. The condition of objectivity, the condition of actuality, is intrinsically unresolvable. Nothing resolves precisely, nothing can be determined precisely as to exactly what it is, exactly the condition that it is in. So experience consists of a continual interfacing with a context of information that does not come together, that does not gel into a final or precise condition that can be pinned down, that can be defined, that can be determined. Science comes up against this continually. Science is a never-end. Science is like pushing an event horizon of a mirage or something. It continually refines and looks closer and closer at phenomena, and continually improves. The old theories are thrown out because they're too inaccurate, and then the new wonderful theories come in. But of course they're going to be thrown out as being inaccurate as the new theories come in, and this will continue forever. Because unresolvability is not simply a failure of examination. It's not simply a fault of not looking closely enough or not having powerful enough scientific tools. Unresolvability is intrinsic in the condition itself. The condition itself is intrinsically ambivalent. The condition itself is intrinsically ambiguous. So a precise resolution, any looking at it and not finding an answer, is finding the precise answer, which is that there is no answer. There is no condition of a way that things are. So a psychological sense of confusion, or a sense of not being able to orient to an objective environment accurately, is actually a very accurate orientation to the objective environment, which is intrinsically ambiguous. So basically, the answers to all questions are question marks, and that's not a failure of being able to get the answer. That is the actual answer. The actual answer is that there is no precise answer. There's a sort of a range of answers. You're always dealing with a bell curve or a quantum ambiguity or something along these lines, where the data is readable, but it doesn't cohere, it doesn't converge into a final result. It's always a scatter of information that is not coherent. So coming to see precisely that it's exactly that way, imprecision, if you like, is precisely the case. Coming to see that is so, and settling into the implications of what that's like, is the final result of spirituality. So one comes to see one's objective condition is a cloud, is murky, if you like, is intrinsically ambiguous, and so what one is cannot be said. There's not a particular answer to what you are. There's not a particular answer to what your situation is. There's not a particular answer to what anything is. Not as a failure of observation, but as the actual condition of the objective reality, of actuality itself. So, which turns the whole notion of confusion on its head. In the conventional sense, we're used to thinking of confusion as a problem. I don't understand. I'm confused. And actually, it's the other way around. If you're confused, that is precise understanding. So this is yet another interesting aspect of this curious condition that we seem to inhabit. Yoga is investigating what is going on here, what this is. Realization is discovering what this is. A great deal of the difficulty in this endeavor is that what's actually going on here bears a very, very, very little and very, very oblique relationship to what we usually attend to, namely all of the events and activities in our lives and in our environment and our history and so on and so forth. It's rather analogous to when you're dreaming, trying to find out what a dream is. So the initial reaction is, well, I want to find out what's going on here. So the initial reaction might be, well, let me look around at what's happening. And so you might look around at the contents of the dream. You seem to be, let's say you seem to be in a public place, maybe some kind of a club or a party or who knows what. And you look around and you try to, well, so what's going on here has something to do with all of this that's appearing and all of this seeming context that's appearing. But of course, that's not true. The dreaming itself exists in no relationship to the content that's appearing, except being the basis for its apparition. And you will find out very little about the principles, the properties of dreaming itself by looking at the contents of a dream, except to notice the way that if you look closely at the contents, they do not exist in the way that you are thinking they do. So it's a kind of a dismantling or a negative discovery when you discover, well, what's going on here is not what I thought it is, which is very powerful because then it frees up the field of exploration to get down to what is actually present. There's absolutely nothing whatsoever here than radiant presence, or whatever you want to call it. That's what I call it. Doesn't matter what you call it. It is what it is. It has nothing to do with an environment. It has nothing to do with a world. It has nothing to do with a body. It has nothing to do with a life. It has nothing to do with history. It has nothing to do with any of that, except very, very, very obliquely, in that it is the basis and the context within which all of this seeming complexity is appearing. But its nature and what it is has essentially nothing to do with this, very much in the same way that dreaming has nothing to do, or very, very little to do, with the content of what seems to be occurring within a dream. So this is largely one of the major hurdles that the yogi has to overcome, because naturally we have a lifelong indoctrination in orienting to all of the events of our lives and our bodies and our health and our success and failure and our social relationships and our relationship to material objects and all of these sorts of things. And so, because we're used to orienting to that, this is where we look when we wish to discover what's going on. And we see this in much popular spirituality, where people get the erroneous idea that, well, how I hold my body matters, or what I say or don't say matters. As if what dreaming had anything to do with what you seem to say in a dream. You could be in a dream. You could be talking beautiful, poetic sentences, or you could be screaming curses. And what difference would it make? None of that has anything to do with the fact of dreaming. And it's that fact that is the important fact, not the fact of what seems to be happening or not happening. But of course we have a lifelong indoctrination in the importance of all of this seeming content of our experience. But in terms of yoga, for the purposes of yoga, this is essentially nothing other than a distraction. So, on the other hand, everything that appears, the way that it appears, and what is actually appearing substantially, is a direct revelation of the nature of radiant presence. So, by looking at experience itself, the if you will, the mechanical presence, the immediate substantial presence of experience, and seeing what that is, how that is, one can discover a great deal about this astounding condition that exists, that one consists of. The essence of yoga is coming to see what actuality actually consists of, and especially to discover the way that it does not conform at all to our normal ideas of it and our normal descriptions of it that people typically impose on actuality in their consensus reality worldview. Actuality is completely unpatterned. Now that may be a difficult thing to understand because, we're all very used to looking around. I can look around the room and I see a lamp and I see chairs and I see all these things. And I can say, well, aren't these patterns? Well, of course they're patterns, but the patterns themselves are unpatterned. A good way to understand this is to think of a stream running along. Suppose you're on the bank looking at a stream running past. So there's all of these waves. But the stream is unpatterned, even though there's a high degree of information present in the waves, but no pattern can be found because the waves are continually moving. They never form a particular shape or configuration. They are absolutely dynamic. They never repeat. And you can never pin down precisely what any shape is present in the waves, because even if you look at it instantaneously, it's shifting from one thing to another thing continuously. And all of experience is exactly like this. Every single bit of your experience, even though it presents with an infinity of information, an infinity of seeming patterning, all of the patterning is actually unpatterned because it does not ever repeat. It cannot ever be resolved as to exactly what the pattern is, because it, like the flowing, the ripples in the surface of a brook, all of the patterns are continually changing, never repeating, absolutely dynamic, and they are unresolvable in terms of observation, because no matter how closely you look at it, you can't pin down all the information that's there. There's literally an infinity of information in experience. So if you're taking a tally of what you know in terms of looking at patterns within your experience and you're trying to pin these patterns down, you can never get to the bottom of the information in any portion of a pattern at all. And because of this, you will discover very quickly that, in fact, actuality is unpatterned. It has no findable pattern. And now this, all of our analysis and our interpretation of our experience is based upon patterning. It's based upon being able to distinguish this from that, and what is being distinguished there is experiential patterns that are held to be distinguishable from each other and also held to be findable as being what they are, which would of course be necessary for them to be distinguishable. But if you go looking again, since in fact there are no resolvable patterns, nothing is able to be distinguished absolutely from anything else. Of course, pragmatically, we can draw all sorts of distinctions, which we do all the time. We want a tuna sandwich instead of a hard-boiled egg, or whatever. But all of that is not is very, very generalized. It does not get down to what is actually present. So in terms of understanding actuality and understanding what one is and what this is, it's essential to come to notice, to come to discover the unpatterned nature of everything, because then the basis for distinguishing things is shattered, is disproved, is invalidated.